Thank you for joining us, Davis. You recently completed a big investigation into suicides in the Army, and you found that those in tanker units were at an especially high risk. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, to recap the Broken Track investigation, we took 3 years of Army non-combat death data and found that holders of the 19 kilo occupational specialty, or enlisted tank crew members, were nearly 3 times as likely as other active duty soldiers to die by suicide. Zooming out a little bit, we found that members of Armored Brigade combat teams were more than twice as likely to kill themselves as other soldiers. At that point, we started talking to experts in the Army's tank community and to mental health experts as well. They told us that a new line of suicide prevention research holds that people who have a lot of stress and difficulty in their daily lives are at a greater risk of suicide if they suffer an acute stressor after that. And what they told us was that members of the armor community who had been experiencing a really high deployment rate and a lot of overwork over the past decade certainly fit the bill and likely face a higher systemic suicide risk than other members of the Army.
So, what has the response been from Congress?
We've heard back from a number of lawmakers regarding our work. One of them, Representative Don Bacon, he's a Republican representative from Nebraska. He's the head of the House Armed Services Committee's Quality of Life subpanel. Bacon told us that it's time for the Army to begin reassessing whether it needs to have a tank brigade permanently living in Europe. The reason for that is one of the big sources of strain for the Army's tank community has been the need to fill a constant quota of overseas deployments for these tank brigades. They've been rotating there on the one after the other basis for almost a decade now, and the demand only increased in the wake of the Ukraine war. We also heard from Representative Chrissy Houlihan. She's a Democrat from Pennsylvania, also a member of the House Armed Services Committee. She and Senator Angus King, an independent from Maine, told us that the Pentagon needs to get it together and submit overdue suicide data that they were supposed to have to Congress back in December. Those numbers were supposed to include suicides broken out by career field dating all the way back to 2001. The two lawmakers were pretty clear that the data is intended to inform legislation that can help save lives among service members, because military suicide has been something that the Defense Department can't quite shake.
What is the Pentagon saying about this? Have you heard back from them?
So we spoke with the Office of the Secretary of Defense about the deployment rates for certain units. The way it currently works is that for a unit to go overseas after not meeting a minimum amount of time at home requires a waiver either from the Defense Secretary or at a certain level from their respective service secretary. We asked for data about those waivers to try to see if there were other communities that are being impacted by high operational tempo and deployments, and the Pentagon said that's classified. We're going to keep digging into that to see if we can bring out more info. The Army also got in touch with me and talked to me some about measures they're taking to try to make life better for their armor units. One of them is an effort at Fort Cavazos, Texas, for example, to reduce maintenance stress on soldiers by better educating battalion executive officers on how to run maintenance programs. Long nights in the motor pool, turning wrenches on tanks and Bradleys, are some of the biggest stressors that these guys constantly face. But at a more programmatic level, the Army told me recently that they're actually looking to change the way that they prepare tank units for deployment. Instead of having 16 months to do their modernization and then their training, they want to take that period and extend it to 24 months with a full year for modernization and a full year for training. Army officials told me that they hope that means tank units will be able to have a more sustainable pace of prep for their 8-month deployment, and that will allow for full maintenance cycles in between training events. That should therefore defray some of those extra hours in the motor pool that really drive up stress.
For those of us following this story, what can we be watching for in those weeks ahead?
I would keep an eye out for more reporting from us on the way that the Army manages its pre-deployment cycles and on other units that may be undergoing similar strains. The problem of operational tempo is one that really gets at the core of quality of life programs impacting service members right now. Some viewers may think back to the surges during the global war on terror and say, well, hey, I deployed pretty rapidly during that period. But service members who did that were well compensated. When you're in a combat zone, you don't pay taxes and you have other additional allowances based on that. But the service members who've been doing these non-combat deployments, say to Europe, to Korea, to the Middle East in the post-GWOT world, they don't have those same financial incentives, but they have to spend the same amount of time away from their families and away from their homes.
Well, thank you for joining us today and talking about this very important reporting that you've done.
Thanks for having me.